tonight the final vision that Daniel has. And what Daniel has for us is really going to be the last of the information, other than kingdom prophecies, which are scattered throughout all of the prophets. But the last of the information in order about how history is going to play out. We have studied, and we studied through most of the Old Testament. We study history as it's recorded by those who were living it, with God's comment and commentary upon it, with the prophets from time to time telling us about the future, so that the people of God would be assured of God's care, His provision, His knowledge, His supremacy, His sovereignty. But future prophecies aren't the mainstay of Revelation. But in this section, as the Old Testament is drawing to a close in the time of Revelation, there is this outpouring of instruction of the future through the prophet Daniel. And tonight's prophecies will encompass a period of over 600 years. Well, we'll start tonight. There's no way to finish in one. But Daniel will show history over the next 600 years. So the intertestament period is a period that is subject to and you're given instruction by God's revelation about. But when we sometimes talk about the period of biblical silence, again, as we've stressed, God is silent during the period, but He's not silent about it. And so again, Daniel living right before the return, which would then be the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the prophets Obadiah, Zechariah, also the book of Esther, and the final prophet Malachi. Daniel was a good 100 years before some of those people, maybe a little bit more than that. But his prophecies will tell us the history that those people will have, and it tells us the history that the succeeding generations of the Bible silence time will have. And Daniel's prophecies will take us certainly up to and through the Maccabean revolt, Maccabean rebellion. And then Daniel's last prophecies pretty clearly seem to indicate Herod the Great and some of the atrocities he does. And so that gets us right up into the gospel, doesn't it? Because who's one of the early main characters? He's the bad guy, but who's one of the early main characters in the Gospels? It's Herod, right? And so Daniel ends very much where the Gospels pick up. So that's how long a span that these prophecies will cover. And so when we cover this period, we definitely have biblical revelation to work from. I recall our good friend of now past and of blessed memory, Pete, and how much Pete hated any mention of Josephus, any mention of the Maccabees and all of that stuff. And he just thought that wasn't biblical. There's certainly, those can be overused, but we've mentioned Josephus a couple of times in his record of history of these things, but we're not going to mention him much. And we will, though, mention the Maccabees a decent amount, because they are prophesied. And their time and the thing that they did, it was foreseen by Daniel. And also, the aftermath of what those folks did really helped set the stage for the New Testament. So we will have, after this lesson, a couple of lessons where we fill in the gaps in between what these prophecies saw and that New Testament world full of Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots and Essenes and all these other first century groups and biblical characters, and what's their motivation and why they're doing the things they do. We'll have a little bit of fill-in, but we don't have a lot, because Daniel's prophecies will so thoroughly give us a coverage and framework over the whole period. And so this Daniel 10 through 12, it's really one grouping. I know it's 3 chapters, but it's one grouping. We'll take them as a single unit, and we'll see what's there. I do want to share with you this chart of our key points for this lesson. So let me find that. There we are. that is not the chart I'm expecting, obviously. There we are. So the final vision, Daniel, there's just a title slide there. And then here are our key points for this lesson. We have God knowing and controlling what the saints would face for generations to come. You can't, with this much accuracy, predict all the things that are going to come without a complete knowledge. So we talk about God's omniscience, but we also talk about his governance of the world, as Daniel would affirm back in chapter 2, setting up kings and kingdoms, or the Apostle Paul to the pagans in Acts 17, establishing the times and the epochs and the borders of people's habitations. And so we have in this prophecy clearly the control of God, the knowledge of God, the protection of God for his people. Also, the Jewish struggles, their victories and their interactions with world powers. So the great powers of the world that come and go, the ones that we know when we study in history class. So tonight we're going to have Xerxes, the great king of Asia, the great king of the Persians who invaded Greece, and things like the 300 at Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis and some of those things. Those are the guy that prophecy foresees, and it doesn't give a lot of detail about that, but it does describe a man who would cause those events. Then it talks about Alexander coming, as we have in prior prophecies, and about the four kingdoms, particularly two of them, and we'll have a lot of interactions with these people, and eventually by the end of this prophecy, because it is an amazing prophecy, unlike any other, where it is just simply detail after detail of history over this long span. And we'll even find other people we know from our history books by the time we end this prophecy. We'll find guys like Antony and Cleopatra. We'll find Caesar. We'll find other people you know from your history books. They and their actions are seen in brief in this prophecy. The only thing I can really think of as comparable, where it's just a laying out of fact after fact after fact in an order of things in a historical event, is maybe like Psalm 22, which describes fact after fact, even the very words that are said at the crucifixion scene. If you read Psalm 22, you're almost like you're reading one of the Gospels, but you're reading it as prophecy. Well, this section of Daniel, the 11th chapter in particular, but this chapter of Daniel, this section, will give us that in regard to history. And lastly, what we'll see is the ultimate end is the victory of God's Messiah. So the Messiah he sends, that's the ultimate victor in all the things that Daniel sees. That's the consummation of it. That's the high point. That's the end of the story, as it were. The Messiah and his people win, which is a lot of the things that we would also gather eventually from the 70 weeks prophecy back in chapter 9, although this has a more optimistic tone to it than does Daniel 9. Okay, so that's our key points as we go into our study. And I want to show you, I want to show you the timeline. So if you have your timeline, if you got your lesson downloaded, I want to look at this timeline just briefly. We'll see that this prophecy includes three great spans of history. It has the Persian section. So there's a section of this, it's pretty quickly dispensed with, just a couple of verses. But the Persian Empire, their rule and their fall is prophesied, particularly King Artaxerxes. Then the great king that comes, Alexander the Great, and his quick demise, and even a prophecy of what will happen to his family, that none of his family are able to rule. And I might go to a little bigger version, but same chart, but bigger version. We got Alexander, his quick rule and reign, and then the division into four. There was a 10 or 15 year period after his death where it took a while to get sorted out. But the rule of the four, and the two of them that make important times for us, an important part of the prophecy in Bible history, the Ptolemies in Egypt, who ruled to 30 BC. That's where Anthony, Cleopatra, Caesar, Caesar's son by Cleopatra, all that gets involved in that. That's foreseen. The Seleucids rule in Damascus down to 64 or 63 BC, when at the same time that the Romans take over Damascus, in the same year they get the territory of Judea. And so Jerusalem goes from a Babylonian province, like in the book of Esther, to a Hellenistic province, as we'll see in these prophecies, and involved in these wars amongst the Greek rulers. And then eventually the New Testament setting that we know so well, Roman Judea. That Judea is a province of the Empire of Rome. And it's in those days, in the days of Caesar Augustus, of course, that Jesus is born. And we have marked on this timeline the time of Jesus' public ministry, 30 to 33 AD. And so the Romans had been in charge for about 95 years or so when that occurred, when Jesus' public ministry occurred. But it's only about another 40 years, maybe not quite that, round number 40 years, until the Romans will destroy Jerusalem. And so Daniel sees that. So when Daniel sees these things, Jerusalem lies in ruins, and the temple is flat to the ground. And when these prophecies end, where are things again? Jerusalem is destroyed, and the temple is flat on the ground, but the saints of God have been taken care of. And so then the Roman Empire continues for a good long while after that. So that is our timeline. We might have one more, a little bit of overall history just to remind us. Here is following the Persian rule. Here is who controls Jerusalem and Judea. First, it's Alexander, and then there's a period of instability after his death. But eventually, the Ptolemies control Jerusalem more or less. There are some very brief spans where the Seleucids get a hold of it. There's one period where the city changes hands 4 or 5 times in a very short period of time. But basically, the Ptolemies have it by and large, and the vast majority of the time for 100 years. Then, though, the Seleucids have it, and the Seleucids have it for about 40 years. But what an eventful 40 years it is. And Antiochus IV, and I notice there's a typo on this chart. It says Antiochus VI, that really should say the 4th. So the I is in the wrong place. The I and the V are reversed because Roman numerals. So it's Antiochus IV, and it's his atrocities that get a guy named Judas Maccabee really stirred up. And his family leads a revolt. Eventually, his family becomes the leaders and kings of Jerusalem and then Judea. And so the Hasmoneans, which I'm not really sure why we go from Maccabeans to Hasmoneans, maybe it's just a different branch of the family because it's one of his nephews and great-nephews who are really the main leaders. Anyway, these people are a Jewish royal family. They make themselves the king. They also make themselves the high priest. As we mentioned before, that starts the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees say to these people, look, you guys are the wrong kings. You're from the wrong family. You're not from the tribe of Judah. You're not from the lineage of David. You're not supposed to be the king. And oh, by the way, we know you're priest, but you shouldn't be the high priest. You're the wrong family for that too. And so that's really where the Pharisees get started, is in this objection to the earthly and really selfish power of the Maccabees and their descendants. And then after not quite, right around 100 years, the Romans take over. So in this period of study, we're going to have Jerusalem under control of the Medo-Persians, of the Greeks, of 2 different warring factions of Greeks, of Jewish self-rule, and eventually Rome. So all that is history to us. All that is prophecy by Daniel. And it helps to know, I think, these things in broad outline to understand some of the just really fractured situation of the Jewish community in the time of the Gospels. Why are all these people at each other's throat? Why are there so many different kinds and groups of Jewish people? And so I can just imagine somebody today, you drop them in to Washington, D.C., and try to explain to them, well, we got 2 major parties, but there's divisions among them, and some of the Democrats are Greens, and some of the Republicans are Libertarians, and some of these people are just anarchists, And some of these people, just try to explain that to somebody in short order. And, that's, I think, would be a little simpler even than this Jewish situation as it came to be. Okay, so let me get back to our text slide tonight. So we'll start in chapter 10, where we have a terrifying man, but he comes with a message and action of comfort. And so he is totally terrifying to Daniel, and he really is very much like Jesus of Revelation 1. The glorified Jesus of Revelation 1 is really similar to this terrifying man that Daniel sees. And also we see a lot of things in this last part of Daniel which will be directly related to and parallel to things in the book of Revelation. It's just a great number of things are parallel. And it starts with the vision of this man who it comes in great glory, so much glory that he scares Daniel to his wits' end, but he comes with a message of comfort. And isn't that how Jesus appears to John on Patmos? Okay, I've talked for a bit, and that's kind of a very long introduction, but it's, I think, important to have. Any questions or comments before we would go on to examine the text here in chapter 10? Oh, Steve, I think you're on mute. Steve, were you saying something, Steve, to us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I know that there are some that say here in these next several chapters that this is the incarnate Christ that has appeared. I know there are some, the Jehovah's Witnesses say that this is evidence that Christ is Michael the Archangel. That is, they present this as evidence to that point, that he is not the God, but a God.
Yeah, is the right word for that theodicy, an appearance of God? And there are a couple of times where it sure seems as though Christ himself is the one who has appeared. The New Testament tells us that Christ was the rock from which the water came. If I had to hazard a guess as to who this great man was, I might think it's Jesus. If I had to put a name, I think this quite likely would be a vision of Jesus in a pre-incarnate appearance. I don't think that does any necessary damage to any other text. It's consistent with other things. If you don't think it's Jesus, if you think it's some other, archangel or truly other exalted being, that's fine too. I wouldn't argue with it for a minute. But I don't know how, if that is Jesus, it makes him in any way a creation or the like. He does stand with Michael. This man does, and he stands as a helper to him, or maybe Michael to a helper to him. But they stand working together, and so to me, I don't know how you'd make much of a doctrinal point out of this. Although, if you are, as some groups do, denying the deity of Christ, then I guess you'd go for anything you could get. And I think that's what they may have done.
I'm kind of the same point. Whether he is or is not, it's kind of, to me, is a moot point. I think verse 11 there is more fitting to how Daniel is, his relationship to God and what he is thought of by God. That is what is more important than whether or not this is Christ or not.
Yeah, it is truly an unbelievable compliment of what is said here. I can only think of two or three, anything equivalent at all to what is said of Daniel here. We'll just read it here out of turn. Daniel, you're a man treasured by God. Understand the words that I'm saying to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you. And he said this to me, and I stood trembling. Enoch, who walked with God. Elijah, who God sends a chariot for. Paul, who tells of Timothy that I have no other man who has the heart and the mind of Christ and shares my concern for you. Okay, that's my list. That's my list of similar compliments.
There in verse 11, the American Standard puts it is that this man talks to Daniel and said, "You are greatly loved, greatly beloved." How can you get any better than that?
Yeah, that's the goal, isn't it? Greatly beloved. This translation says treasured. And I was thinking in my notes here, I had a third translation, a third rendering of that, but I don't see it. All right, so yes, it is absolutely the highest compliment. So we start with Daniel in, again, the third year of King Cyrus of Persia. Now okay, well, what's that mean to you and me? Third year of Cyrus.
Different reign.
Long time ago, definitely we're in the Persians. The thing that is significant in the book of Daniel with this date, and I think it's important, most of the events of Daniel have dates that we don't always recognize. For instance, that the year that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire, and God spared them. That is very likely right before or right after, like same calendar year or just a hair on either side of the time when the main body of Jews got to exile. And so what was shown to the whole world just when the Jews get to exile, when they stop there, when the wagon trains have got them to exile, their God reigns, right? And so there's other things in the book of Daniel. Daniel is shown that the Persians are going to go away 10 years before the handwriting appears on the wall. So he was already prepared. Well, in this case, the third year is also a momentous year. When you look at Jewish history, this is the year when the Jewish exiles are going back home. Because when Cyrus got in office, he makes the decree that all the Jews go home, right? Now I got to ask you today, if someone said, "I want all these people out of here," how fast could you get people to a place that's 700 or 800 miles away? Well, if you put them all on airplanes, you can get them out of here in a hurry, right? And so we think about a few times where there's been a mass evacuation. I think about the boat people who fled Vietnam to get away from the communists. It took them because they were all in their little tiny boats and they had to go to other ports in the Far East, and then eventually a lot of them came to America. A lot of those people were 2 years. They were 2 years in the travel from fleeing communist Vietnam to getting to America resettlement. And some of it was quite a bit longer. It takes a while, right? So today we kind of sometimes think about a mass evacuation or moving people, and send in the government, send in the guys with the clipboards, send in the big trucks, get these people on planes, trains, and automobiles, and we can get people out of here. But there's other times where it takes a while. In the ancient world, it took a while to move everybody to Jerusalem, and it took a while to move them all back. And so this third year, this is the same year the Jews go back to Jerusalem. And so Daniel sees this prophecy about what's going to happen in that city and to these people the year they go back. So that is, I think, significant. Now, it's also significant in verse 1, and this is a thing that we don't very often see. You already mentioned one thing we don't see much, is that you are greatly loved. In verse 1, it continues, "This message is true," it says, and it was about a great conflict. And it says, Daniel understood the message and had understanding of the vision. Now, that's different, isn't it? Most of the time, do even the prophets know of all the things they're saying? this, I think, Daniel, between his discernment, between his wisdom, which Daniel naturally, I think, was a very gifted man, wouldn't we all think? But also, what's he been doing for the last 75 years? He's been God's premier prophet, right? Even though in exile there was also Ezekiel, and even though for most of his life there was also Jeremiah, but really, who's been God's sort of premier prophet and revealer of knowledge and a man of true understanding? Has been this man here. And so I don't know, I couldn't say for sure that he understood this in the sense of wisdom and of foresight, and he gets what was said, or probably more likely, how does one understand a prophecy? God tells you. I think that God showed him in a way that would be probably deep and detailed, and maybe even to us surprising, because we get to look at all this with what? The benefit of history, right? And how clear is hindsight? Hindsight's 20/20. Daniel, I think, probably had a real understanding, because that's what the text says. He understood the message. He understood the vision. And so I think this is sort of like Moses. Moses got to see the promised land, right? But not clearly. Moses saw it from a distance, from a hilltop. He had at least that much view of history, that this is going to be sealed up, and this is going to be not understood by the people in its time. This is going to be hidden from them as part of God's mystery, right? And there's so much about the mystery of God. But Daniel, if we could ask him after this, say, could you, we have our history books, and Daniel has his foreknowledge. I bet you Daniel's foreknowledge would match up a lot better than we might otherwise have. It's a reason to think. It'd be a surprising level of understanding. So I think that was a special gift of God that he gave Daniel this in his old age, as he gives him this last prophecy. Now, the other thing that's interesting, and we're not sure exactly the detail of exactly the situation, but when this vision came, Daniel had been mourning for 3 weeks. He said, I didn't eat any rich food, nor meat or wine enter my mouth. So he's just eating the most basic and plain of food. I didn't put any oil on my body until the 3 weeks were over. So nothing of comfort. Nothing of, no comfort food, no comfort products. This is kind of rough living. And he does this for 3 weeks. And he says, on the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up and there was a man dressed in linen. All right, we'll talk about the man in a second. So Daniel's situation is one of real mourning. So kind of like chapter 9, mourning and fasting and lamenting for sin. Here, it's a mourning that's troubled him deep enough and great enough that he's eating basic food. He's not quite on a fast. He's not on a 3-week fast, but he's not far off of it. And really doing nothing for bodily comfort if something is greatly on his mind. We can only speculate as to the exact situation. This is, again, the time the Jews return to Jerusalem. I wonder if maybe he's greatly concerned over their imminent return. Or maybe they're traveling. And maybe the big party of the Jews is going, and he's got some bad report has made it that something hasn't gone well on the journey. I don't know, but something is concerning him, and generally most of the time something concerns Daniel. It's the people of God. Now it could have been government business. Something could have been going really poorly in the kingdom. That's possible. But we don't really know the exact situation of which he was so troubled. But Daniel's not a man easily shaken, is he? And something is deeply on his mind. And so God sends this message, and these messengers seem to be in direct response to the situation. So we can only I think we can only rightly conclude it's probably about the state of the Jewish people. Something is bothering him greatly in their regard. So then comes the man who is very similar to the glorified Jesus of Revelation 1. And this man comes in linen, a belt of gold, of uspa around his waist, a body like beryl, his face like the brilliance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and his feet gleam of polished bronze, and the sounds of the words are like the sound of a multitude. Well, that would be a real good summary of Jesus in Revelation 1, wouldn't it? The glorified Jesus who appeared to John. And so that's one of the reasons why we're, as Christians, so quick to identify this with Jesus, again, especially of Revelation 1, verses 14 through 16. And the effect is very much like the appearance of Jesus to Saul on the road to Damascus. Because who sees this great man? Only I, Daniel, saw the vision. The men who were with me did not see it, but a great terror fell on them, and they ran and hid, and I was left alone. Well, when the Lord appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, who heard the voice of Jesus? Paul did. And what about the men with him? They heard something, but they couldn't make it out. Isn't that what it says in Acts 9, I think? I think it says they heard like thunder. Am I misremembering that? I think I'm.
I think I remember there are two accounts, and they seem to contradict each other a little bit.
There are three, actually.
Are there three? It
Yeah.
seems like there was some contradiction in there at one time.
It's certainly, there are places that are a little bit hard to harmonize. I wouldn't say contradict, but I would at least go hard to harmonize in some of the detail. All right, so not in 9, because it just mentions the detail of him getting up off the ground, from which we conclude he fell to the ground.
Mine says that the men heard the voice, but they held no man.
So they didn't see him. That's right. I thought one of them said they didn't understand the voice.
There is one that says that. I can't remember where it's at, but it's confusing because in one they saw him and didn't hear it, and the other they
Yes.
just the opposite, I think.
9, they saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And then in 26, is that where it says they heard the voice? Which is the one? Which is the one you just read, Steve?
There in chapter 9.
In 9, okay. So in 9 they heard, and in 22 they didn't hear. Okay. I'm giving the explanation, the harmonizing explanation. That's what I was remembering. The harmonizing explanation is to hear. They heard. One said they heard. One said they didn't hear. And so the harmonizing explanation is they heard that there was something going on, but they didn't get what those words were. And so because sometimes, like you know something was said, but have no idea what. I find that I don't know why, but that's happened to me more recently. I think my children do it intentionally. They say things and it's like, what? So I know something was said, but I have no idea what. So would you describe that as hearing the voice, or would you describe that as not hearing? And so I think that's the best explanation there in Acts, to harmonize those, is there was a hearing without hearing. Which actually, come to think of it, maybe I have been doing that since I was a youth. Mom and Dad aren't here tonight, so we can't double check. I think my children have that aspect sometimes, hearing but not hearing. Okay, so these men, as we go back to Daniel now, these men attending Daniel, and you think about a man of Daniel's stature, there's always going to be some attendants, some servants, somebody with him, and so they are there. They know something's wrong with the boss, and now they are greatly distressed. They know something big is going on. They run away. He's left alone, and he has a vision. And like John, who in Revelation 1 fell at the Lord's feet like a dead man, he said, I had no strength in me. My face grew deathly pale. I was powerless. I heard the words he said, and when I heard them, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So just out he goes. And so this was an overwhelming experience. Again, it's so similar to Revelation 1. It's almost impossible not to compare it with that. So, but the thing is, it's not, the angel has not come to frighten. The angel has come to console. The angel has come to help. Or this being, I called him an angel, this maybe appearance of the Lord, but this man. And so there's a hand touching him, shaking him. He's shaking on my hands and knees. And he says, as he rouses him, he says, Daniel, you are, American Standard, greatly beloved. This Christian Standard, man treasured by God. So understand that I'm saying to you, so that this vision, stand on your feet, I've been sent to you. And after he said this to me, I stood trembling. So even after that kind of welcome and that kind of assurance, being in the presence of this Holy One is still a great, a greatly frightening thing. I just found the other translation. You're a man of high esteem. So you are held in high esteem, and I've been sent to tell you about this. And so it's because he has set his heart, verse 12, don't be afraid, for from the first day you propose to understand and humble yourself before your God, your prayers were heard. And I've come to you because of your prayers. And so that seems to be in relation to this 3-week incident of him praying for understanding, of his praying for knowledge and wisdom about the things that are going on. And that's what makes me think that this occasion is he's heard some troubling report about Israel, about the people, either in their preparation to go or on their journey to go, or maybe the first reports of what happened when they got back, because this 3rd year is the year of return. So something has troubled him, and he sought to understand, and God says, as soon as you set your heart, then you were going to have this prayer answered, which I think is an encouragement to us in prayer. How far into prayer do we have to get before there'll be an answer? Well, in chapter 9, it was as soon as you started to pray. And here it was as soon as you set your heart to pray. And so, there wasn't a prayer probation period where we're going to make sure, let's let him sweat it out for a few more hours. Let's see if he keeps praying. There doesn't seem to be any of that. But we also see in this, really, the regard that God has for his people. That, the psalmist asked generally, what is man that you are mindful of him? Well, here's a man that God is very mindful of. And what kind of messenger did he send? This is one of the top shelf messengers, isn't it? This is one of those messengers that are sitting pretty close to the throne. It's not one of those guys who was down on the far end of the bench. Well, who are we going to send? All right, get Leroy down there. Send, is there an angel Leroy? I'm not sure. But this is the top shelf messenger here that they're sending. So again, don't be afraid. Now, he says, I had to interrupt something to come see you. And that tells us how important, because this sounds like it was a big deal. He said, well, also because you sought to understand and you humbled yourself. We might just make a last point before we go from that. If you want to really understand the will of God, what are some things necessary? Seek to understand with humility. All right. What's the biggest thing that gets in the way of people understanding the Word and the will of God? Isn't it pride? Pride. So, have humility. Okay, so, again, it sounds like it's a pretty important thing that was interrupted. He said, because the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, after I've been left there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days. These visions refer to those days. Okay, I got to say, there's a lot there I don't get. The world governance and God's mechanisms of world governance, I have to say, are above my pay grade. Just are. Now, how long has Daniel been praying? 3 weeks. And how long has this man of God been detained with this king of Persia business? 21 days. Well, by my calendar, that's the same thing, right? And so here is Daniel, greatly beloved, and high on God's favorite list. But why did he have to wait? Because the messenger who was going to go to him had other business. Now, are there times when we might need to wait for what we want, and we might need to wait for the Lord to provide and the Lord to help us, because the Lord has other things that need to be done first? That there be some sequence of helping things. Now, I don't know why they couldn't have sent Michael earlier. I don't know what Michael was doing. I don't know why they needed Michael, couldn't have sent some other people to go do it. But that's the explanation that's given. I would have come sooner, but I had this king of Persia business to deal with, which also tells you how important is Daniel. His business is right up there with the king of Persia business, isn't it? And his business is the Lord's people. And so before we go from that, maybe one other thing that's interesting. This man of God here is in some kind of confrontation with the king of Persia, and later it will mention the prince of the Persians as well. I don't understand exactly how that works, because at this point Cyrus is the king, right? We got the two kings, Cyrus, and we've got Darius. They're co-regents or co-kings, and both of them seem to be with the program of helping Daniel and helping God's people. Cyrus is the one prophesied by Isaiah to be God's messenger, to be God's shepherd, to be God's servant, and he sends the Jews home. And Cyrus, by every indication of world history and the things we know about him, Cyrus was if you had to live under an ancient king, Cyrus would have been a good one to live under. Not just that he sent the Jews home, which we know from Scripture. The Babylonians had scrambled people from all over their empire. There's a thing called the Cyrus Cylinder, which records Cyrus sending dozens of people back to their homelands. And in the early part of the Persian Empire, they were known for justice, and they were known for fairness, especially compared to how the Babylonians were. Now maybe, I'm sure some modern day civil rights people wouldn't approve of some of the things that Cyrus did. But you look at the ancient world, I mean, he's going to get your A1 emperor rating. And so why is it that Cyrus and Darius here, what is it that they're involved in that there's a prince and a king of Persia of which this man of God has to oppose? That's a thought question, because I don't know the answer. I know enough to ask that question. I don't know enough to answer that question. I thought maybe that there's some kind of behind the scenes thing going on, like in the book of Job. Because in the book of Job, how much does Job know about all that stuff going on in heaven, of God and the angels and the sons of God and the devil getting together and talking about him in a situation? How much does he know about that battle? He doesn't know any of it. But that's actually the main scene, isn't it? That's the important scene in the book of Job. We like to concentrate on the Job part, but what's the main scene? That heavenly scene. Well, there might be some kind of heavenly scene going on that we're not informed of. That is this. There may be some high-ranking, high being of Satan's side, because he is the prince of the power of this world, right? The prince of power of the air. He's the prince of this world. Maybe he's got his delegation that's assigned to Persia. Maybe they're out there causing trouble and wanting to turn this newly formed Persian Empire into something much meaner, more evil, and nasty than it was. And these heavenly ones are restraining them from their influence over the Persians. That's another possibility. And maybe that's an awful lot like the Job one. But I got more questions than I got answers about that. All right, so this man of God, come to give understanding. And again, it's about the last days and the end of time, some translations will say. And so, again, if you have premillennial leanings and you see that, what do you think? Rapture time. It's the end. This prophecy, I think, will very clearly get us up to the time of the Messiah, and will get us up again like Daniel 9 did in the 70 weeks, get us to the end of the sacrifice and the end of the Jewish system. And by the Hebrew writer and some other New Testament usages, what's that called? The last days. It's the end of this time. It's the end of this system. And so I think he sees the end of that. I don't think he sees the literal final judgment. I think he sees the final judgment on Jerusalem and the Jewish system, because when they reject the Messiah, what happens to them? They get a judgment that is similar to and worthy of comparison to the final judgment. But it's not the final, is it? Just the final one for them. It did them in. It didn't do everybody in. And so that'll be next time. But keep that in mind, that he's going to see an awful long way. Now, I know we have kind of limited what the last days and end of time is, but we do want to say that that does convey a very important message, and there's real content there. It's not just that it's not the end of everything, but it's definitely the end of something, and the end of something big and important. And it is the end, I think, of the whole Jewish system to which he will see. All right, so we have a little bit more about that, but our time is gone, and I appreciate your patience as we've gone over a lot of time because we had to start a little bit late. But that's you think about a prophecy. When a man like, that can only be compared to Jesus in Revelation shows up, you're going to be in for a prophecy, aren't you? And so we're going to be in for a prophecy. And there are some things that will remind us that more of Revelation, but the main thing we're going to get in this prophecy when we get into the meat of it is what is going to happen with the Jewish people. And it will be a blow-by-blow predictive prophecy that almost reads like history because it has such detail.